I'm joined now by Neil Saunders on the line. Hi, Neil, and welcome to Dialect.
Hi, Tony. Thank you very much for having me on.
Now, you have written a book called Your Thoughts Are Not Your Own, and it's about mind control. Now, your studying in the past has been in psychology, media production, and film studies. What on earth made you decide to go and have a look at mind control?
Well, to be quite honest, when you sort of do study media and psychology, you tend to find an overlap between the sort of disciplines. And then you start to notice that there's a lot of overt controls in advertising, and there's a lot of overt controls in film production and entertainment and stuff. And
when you say overt control, what do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, just the construction of an image or the construction of an icon in a character. I mean, these will draw back on sort of, Jungian archetypes of heroes, heroines, and stuff like that. I mean, a very, very simple one is just basically if you've got a camera looking up at somebody, they look very authoritarian. If you've got a camera looking down on somebody, they look diminished or weak. And so these are all based on instinctual drives and such like that, and often they're used in advertising and film in a manner that is not immediately apparent to the viewer, and often that is the point for it not to be immediately apparent to the viewer, because when it does become apparent, it loses its effectiveness. And in the advertising, for example, it would be placing a product next to a beautiful woman, or aligning a product with a celebrity who is considered to be sort of an alpha member of the tribe, so to speak.
Now, Your Thoughts Are Not Your Own is a pretty, I suppose, big claim to make. And many people would say mind control, well, that's just poppycock. Now, what about the origins of this? I mean, I know certainly in terms of espionage and spy agencies, they certainly would be looking at whether they can control minds. But is there any basis in fact in how this all started?
Well, absolutely. I mean, it's very sort of, there's a lot of subterfuge in it. I mean, the American CIA projects started in 1951 as BLUEBIRD, and actually the Office of Naval Intelligence actually started in 1947 with Chatter. But these were officially a response to the Korean War. Now, obviously, the Korean War is predated by these particular projects.
Okay, well, tell us about Chatter and BLUEBIRD. What were they? Well,
Chatter was essentially an Office of Naval Intelligence operation to use things like mescaline, scopolamine, THC, which is an extract from marijuana, and various other drugs in interrogation scenarios to be used as truth serums. And I think it was Dr. Charles Savage, actually, of Bethesda Medical College, that actually was the chief officer in charge of that. BLUEBIRD was that was the CIA's first dalliance into it, and mysteriously it started on April the 20th, which is Hitler's birthday, but I'm sure that's just a sad coincidence. And what they were interested in is controlling a man's will, subverting a man's will to make him do something that would normally go against his moral code, and so that they can control somebody covertly or control somebody in such a manner that they could split a personality, that they could have two very real personalities inside one man, and that could be flipped between one another for espionage purposes. Like, for example, one could be very pro-communist and one could be an actual patriotic American.
Gosh, certainly that's the sort of thing the spy agencies would love if they could make that work. But you mentioned a truth serum. Surely that's just a myth, the idea that you could inject something into somebody and then they just tell you the truth, and all their defences, all their training to not tell you stuff will be broken down.
Well, a lot of it depends on the sort of how you treat the person. There's many ways. I mean, you can actually just sort of induce that sort of response by just isolating somebody for a very long period of time, or by forcibly socializing people, which is essentially what the Chinese methods were. They weren't anything new. They were just, wearying people and battering them psychologically. But then, the Americans particularly were very interested in it, and they found that scopolamine was very, very useful. They found that in certain scenarios L.S.D. was, but they also found that certain types of hypnosis were actually very, very useful for actually renting information from people that weren't willing to give it. I mean, obviously, it's not as simple as you can't go up and just basically, right, you're under my control, and tell them you have to work on this person psychologically, and you have to either put them into a state whereby they depend on you, or whereby they trust you so much that they believe anything they reveal. You'd never put them in a scenario that would actually bring them to any sort of harm. So in order to do that in a hypnotic sense, you have to have incredibly, incredibly low sense of ethics and morals and just no scruples at all.
Now, is that what you found was happening? Because this is certainly one thing. I mean, if somebody is under the influence of psychotropic drugs, I mean, you'd need the whole thing would have to be very, very carefully looked at and supervised. Otherwise, I mean, you could possibly damage someone for life psychologically.
Well, absolutely, but I mean, that's not a problem. I mean, there's dozens. I mean, Linda MacDonald is one of the people that basically she went. A lot of these experimentations. This is why they were able to get away with it, is because they were done by very, very prestigious medical doctors. I mean, Ewan Cameron and William Sargent. They were on the Nuremberg trials, prosecuting Nazis, and they were basically in charge of entire departments. Ewan Cameron was the head of the World Psychiatric Association at the time that he was doing essentially LSD and electroshock experiments to wipe people's memories. But Linda MacDonald, for example, she was about 21 when she went there for a sort of very mild case of depression. And when she left, she had no idea who she was. She couldn't remember her children. She couldn't remember her parents or her husband. She didn't even know what a husband was. She had to be taught to speak again. They reduced it to an infinite, and these memories never returned. Now,
you're talking about the whole memory wipe thing there.
Yeah.
I mean, I suppose that actually could be quite useful, couldn't it, in war as well, if someone's got a lot of secrets. What were the sort of applications of these things?
Well, I mean, essentially, the wiping of the memory is to prevent agents, when they're going into retirement, being taken by, I mean, that's probably a euphemism. It's basically to stop them telling everybody where the bodies are buried, really. It's kind of like at the end of the Men in Black, where he comes up with that sort of device and just flashes it in front of people. But, I mean, that's why it was so cold and calculated, because a lot of these people were treating it as medical experiments. I mean, it can be very much likened to the experiments done by Joseph Mengele. In fact, a lot of the experimentation got its start from Joseph Mengele and various other doctors. They were doing experiments at Auschwitz, and they were doing experiments involving mescaline at Dachau and stuff like that. But, actually, if you really want to go into it, this is kind of even older than that, because in sort of mystery religion-type texts and stuff like that, there are incantations and the use of certain potions and stuff like that. I mean, chanting, just the concept of chanting, that puts everybody in a sort of collective mind state. The idea of a mantra, that's a mind control technique. Get everybody on their feet so they're tired, get their arms in the air so that they're weary, and get them to chant something mindless so that they disassociate or become bored.
Now, this whole idea of picking up where the Nazis left off, I wonder, do you think that explains some of the secrecy? Because, I mean, the Americans, the CIA, naval intelligence would say, well, we had to keep this secret because it's part of the military and we can't allow state secrets, a bit like they're saying about GCHQ and the NSA at the moment. So, I mean, was that used to cover up really totally unethical practices, or was there some justification for keeping it secret at the time?
The official justification was we've got to, I think it was Alan Dulles that said we have to keep this intellectual property away from the Russians. But, I mean, it's like your presentation itself. I watched your presentation very recently and then went and watched the World in Action program about Joseph Mengele living in South America. And, he was not actively pursued until the late 50s, and he was captured about 3 times trying to escape from Germany by the Americans, by various different squadrons or whatever, found out who he was and let go, just like various other ones. I mean, obviously we know about the Vatican rat line, and we know about Operation Paperclip. Prouty, Fletcher Prouty, who's the guy that he was made immortalized by being played by Donald Sutherland in the JFK film. He started talking about Ewan Cameron, and Ewan Cameron's experiments were in, as I said, they were actually in Canada, but they were under the Subproject 68 of MKUltra, which is the CIA's program. And Fletcher Prouty basically talks about this particular place, and he says a lot of doctors that were taken there were German, and a lot of them were actually paperclip doctors, because the official explanation is they all went to NASA, Wernher von Braun and people like this, and they were there to expand the V2
They were supposed to be rocket scientists, weren't they?
Yeah, exactly. But obviously there was a lot of other... it's sort of washed over with sort of this concept of crazy genetic experiments and sewing heads together and trying to change the colour of eyes and stuff like that. I think a lot of that was mind control experiments. And one of the things that Mengele certainly did was called trauma bonding, which is essentially utilizing trauma to, it kind of works like sorry to be glib, but it works in the same way that a pimp would control a prostitute through total fear. And essentially it breaks down your psychological process to the point where your ego is so small that anything that goes wrong, you assume it must be your fault, and you assume that it's right and it's only correct that you should be punished for this. And it goes a step further, because basically when your abuser does punish you, you're aware that they are better than you, they're stronger than you, whatever. And they could, given their want, they could kill you. And so when they don't kill you, you feel grateful for that, and you interpret that as love. And essentially that's kind of what is happening to society on a sort of grander scale. And it's no accident, the constant traumatizing nature of increasing bills, constant terror on the streets, terrorism, all this hyped-up drama. And that goes back to an organisation called the Tavistock Institute, which I'm sure you're familiar with. Their sort of concept was, it was called future shock. It was to basically traumatise the entire population to the point where they were in a constant state of fight or flight, reduced to a childlike state called fluidity, and then essentially authoritarians could come in with a sort of calm, sage-like expression and say, what would be the best option for all of you? This. And in that way you can control society.
Well, at least in theory. Naomi Klein has talked about this quite a bit as well. Yeah. Now, but you mentioned there just briefly MK Ultra. This is something which is certainly wasn't designed at the time to be known about at the time, and has only come out since in the US. Just tell us what MK Ultra was. Well,
MK Ultra is the umbrella term. It basically refers to. There was at least 149 sub-projects, so it's just an umbrella term. When people say MK Ultra, what they mean is mind control projects by the CIA. There was MK Delta, MK QK Hilltop, MK Chickwit, MK Delta, MK Derby Hat. There was many delineations, but they could all be broadly under the umbrella of mind control, either individual or social control, and basically they run the whole gamut, and they run the whole gamut from sort of the use of drugs to the use of trauma, to the use of coercion, the use of psychotronic machinery, implants, rays, electromagnetic waves, extremely low frequency waves, that sort of thing, right up to basically, how it can control society through the use of the media, through the use of press releases, disguised advertising, disguised as a press release. The amount of adverts that are disguised as news stories, that all they are is a fear-mongering exercise in selling a product.
Well, just give us an example.
Well, there's a new disease that's come out, blah-de-blah-de-blah, everybody's really up in arms about it. It's all right, though, because this company's got this new drug. Essentially, that's an advertising. That, you get these all the time. There's always some sort of... It's sold as a sort of... have you noticed this problem, blah-de-blah-de-blah. But the intertwining between advertising agencies, the news media, it goes to a shareholder level, and it goes to a board level as well. So essentially, you've got people that are on two different companies and want to do each other's favours. And aside from anything else, are bound by their loyalty and their legal requirement to their shareholders to do the best for them. And so, you often get this. You always get one when it's near an election. You'll get a politician doing something. Crikey. There's always ones that are fake. Last time Obama got caught, he was apparently at a factory in Detroit, and it became very apparent that he was never there, and he was actually in front of a green screen, and the audience had been sort of superimposed afterwards and stuff like that. But it's to sell this product, the president, as a man of the people.
Now, one of the things that I find most fascinating about your research is looking at the way that some of these techniques were used maybe in the 50s and 60s on individuals, and then the way that those interpretations were then spread out to be used on the mass population. I mean, Naomi Klein, as I mentioned before, her film and book, The Shock Doctrine, I think it was her 2004, her third book, explores this, the idea that people are very easy to manipulate when they're being shocked. And also, going back to the 1970s, it almost looks as if these kinds of ideas were being used as a way of manipulating the population in Italy, which looked like it was going to vote for a communist government and bringing a communist government. Obviously, the Americans didn't want that. And so they instituted this thing called the strategy of tension. There were bomb attacks, some of which were possibly by the Red Brigades, and some of which were actually carried out by NATO. And the idea of a strategy of tension, that actually to have tension in the country is good for certain factions and certain politicians who are working for them, because it makes the population easy to manipulate. And I wonder, I mean, particularly with the tension to do with the problems that people are having simply paying bills, staying in their own homes, the threat of eviction, this kind of thing, that technique might be being applied to Britain right now.
Yeah, absolutely it is, because there is no, particularly across the sort of fuel companies, because there's no justification or rationalisation. It's for the increase in fuel prices. It's all based on speculation. And this is down to a government decision of privatisation. Yeah, they could step in, but no, it causes people to worry. And if people are worried, then people are looking out for themselves.
Okay,
which is a perfectly reasonable thing to do. Do you know what I mean? But again, excuse me, you're absolutely right. And it works in several levels. The sort of shocking things to distract you, because I can't be going down and marching against the war. I've got bills to pay. If I miss a day at work, blah de blah de blah, I'm going to lose my house. So you've got all those sorts of levels of distraction.
Okay,
you've got the sort of terrorist aspect, and then you've got the entertainment industry in case you wanted something lighter.
Okay, to distract and dumb down. Anyway, the Manchurian Candidate. Now, this is something which was, I think, probably one of the most famous films about this whole idea of mind control. At a time when it was actually going on, it was quite controversial. Is there any truth to the idea of a Manchurian Candidate, someone who can be sent to do a task, do a job, and be virtually programmed like a computer to do it?
Yes, there is. I mean, it sounds like science fiction. I think there has been a concerted effort to make people believe that it is science fiction. But yes, it certainly can be done, and it can be done in a number of ways. It can be done via a series of hypnotic controls. It can be done via hypnosis with the use of drugs. Scopolamine, for example, I mean, that's coming off in South America at the minute. I mean, people are basically just running up to people, blowing it in the face, and then getting them to empty their bank accounts. Like, if that's known by sort of hoodlums on the streets of Sao Paulo, you don't think he's going to be known by the CIA.
So this is a substance which, it just sort of makes you compliant. This sounds rather frightening stuff, and I would have thought that any responsible government would want to make its population aware that this is going on, and also to control it somehow.
Well, very possibly. I mean, this is the other thing, is there's a flip side, like we were just saying, when any of these stories come out. I mean, this is the sort of fine line that you walk talking about any of these topics, is that they induce fear, and that is sort of their point, to induce fear, because basically, you then freeze like a deer in the headlights. And Manchurian Candidates, they weren't full Manchurian Candidates, they were, but they didn't actually do the shooting. But Mark Chapman and Sirhan Sirhan, the killers, or the supposed killers of John Lennon and Robert Kennedy, they were both under some sort of hypnotic control to perform an action of firing. But I believe that in both those cases they actually fired blanks, and the actual killers were a bloke called Jose Padermo and Eugene Caesar, is my personal opinion, who both just so happened to work for the CIA. But yeah, there is certainly, you can do that. You can put voices in people's heads. I think it's called synthetic telepathy. There's also now
Hang on, just a second. You can put voices in people's heads. How?
Oh yeah,
How?
Absolutely. You can carry it on. Well, there's several things that you can do. Right, you can carry it on an electromagnetic wave pattern. You can essentially speak. There was several people it started with Alan Frey, I believe, the Frey auditory effect. You notice that microwaves basically carry audible signals. From then on, they were able to sort of develop it. There's several people that can do it. Michael Persinger, Igor Smirnov was able to do it.
So what you're talking about, actually pointing a microwave beam at someone's head,
yeah,
and then them being able to actually hear some voice in their ears. Is it? I mean, are they talking? You're talking about it sort of agitating their eardrum or something? How does it work?
It basically forms a voice. It forms a voice that's like you're in a monologue, and this isn't even the most scary stuff that they've got. I'll just give you a brief example. Igor Smirnov, who's a Russian, he's got a thing called the Smirnov pattern. It's now owned by SciTech, which is a CIA-run organisation by John B. Alexander and Ingo Swann. They're into remote viewing and stuff like that. And Ed Dames, so I think he might be dead now. And basically, they bought the Smirnov pattern. It was going to be used during the Waco siege because essentially you can load a voice onto there and pump it directly into people's heads, and they think that they're being spoken to, like from their own, inside their own head. And what they were going to do, they had Charlton Heston record a series of dialogue, and they were going to blast this at David Koresh, and he was going to pretend to be God, Charlton Heston, and tell him to peacefully end the siege. But they decided not to do that. But that's not the worst.
So they went in with tanks instead, didn't they, and burnt the place to the ground?
They said it would be far more sporting to set fire to the front of the building and machine gun anybody that came out the back of the building. But, I mean, the worst technology that I've sort of seen is, basically every emotion release an EEG pattern. Your brain sort of releases electronic signals that can be determined as he is feeling this emotion or he is feeling that emotion. Well, you can use that because, say, when you feel hatred, like white-hot anger, it pumps out a certain resonant spectrum. If you can get that, match that spectrum, put it onto a magnetic wave pattern, and fire it at a brain, the brain doesn't know how to differentiate between an external source and an internal source. So it thinks it's making that emotion, so it makes that emotion, and you can't stop it. So it can reduce you to a blithering, blubbing mass or a white-hot psychopath within a second. And this, silent sound technology, which was developed by Oliver Lowry and was actually used in the First Gulf War, admittedly, that does that. There's various other devices that basically do this. And again, it's very, very frightening because basically you would not know that these feelings are not organic. They are real feelings. It's just that essentially they've got in a step before the brain.
Amazing. Anyway, Neil, one of the most fascinating things you've been talking about, and I think actually really useful for us all, is to know about this drug, scopolamine?
Scopolamine,
because that sounds to me like the sort of thing which there really should be a public awareness campaign about, if it is possible for unscrupulous people to use this to kind of persuade you that they're nice people and give away your credit card details, this kind of thing.
Scopolamine is not really a new drug. I mean, it was being used in the sort of early 50s by Harry Anslinger. Harry Anslinger was the very first drug czar of America and the person that basically made marijuana illegal because he was using marijuana, scopolamine, and LSD, testing it illegally on unsuspecting patients of St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Washington, which was a psychiatric hospital. But scopolamine there is a sort of awareness of it because basically it's been in the Daily Mail and stuff like that saying don't go to South America because you'll get sprayed with scopolamine. But it's one of these sort of cognitive dissonance things where people, I know about scopolamine. No, that's real. Mind control, no, that's impossible, that is. Because of the context in which it's been put.
I mean, it apparently induces confusion, agitation, rambling speech, hallucinations, paranoid behaviour and delusions. And, of course, when you're in that confused state, you're very, very open to suggestion by even some sort of passerby would seem like they're there to help you.
Absolutely. I mean, that's essentially how it works is you can be coerced into anything. But this is, again, it's nothing new. Rohypnol, GHB, these are commonly known as date rape drugs. Even very strong MDMA, in America, it's called Molly. People have been known to drop it in people's drinks, and they become very, very excitable, shall we say, and then they can be easily coerced into sex.
Neil, before we leave you, it'd be nice to just have a few hints of a few websites and books, and then we'll finish with just talking about your own book.
Oh, well, yes, certainly. Well, I mean, great books to find on the mind control subject. Anything by Jim Keith. Mass Control, World Control is fantastic. Jim Keith is unfortunately no longer with us. Operation Mind Control by Walter Bowers is superb. Anything by Dave McGowan, Program to Kill the Politics of American Serial Killers. That's fantastic. That should be sort of standard reading for anybody, really.
And where can we find you online?
On me? Well, I have my own website, which is neilsandersmindcontrol.com. And on there's a series of videos of past presentations, radio appearances, and bits and bobs, a few YouTube videos that I've done. I'm also on Facebook. If anybody would like to, like my page, you can ask me questions. Get in touch with me. I'm usually posting stuff on there. And you can buy my book. Well, it's actually split into 2 volumes, actually. I didn't explain that. The first one's called Mind Control, Mass Manipulation and Perception Management. And the second one, volume 2, is called Marketing, Movies and Music. And obviously it discusses marketing, movies and music and social control and the LSD experiments that sort of coincided with the the hippie movement. Oh, by the way, if you want to know about LSD as well, Acid Dreams by Bruce Schlain and Martin A. Lee is very, very good for that sort of thing. And Inside the LC by Dave McGowan. But my books are available at neilsandersmindcontrol.com and they're available at richplanet.net.
Okay, well, Neil Saunders, author of Your Thoughts Are Not Your Own, published in December 2012. Thanks very much for joining us on Dialect.